So welcome to the Insights Equestrian webinar series. I'm Pete Howard, Professor of the Practice and Executive Director of the Digital Business Institute here at the Equestrian School of Business. I am pleased to be joined today by Andrei Hagiu, Dean's Research Scholar and Associate Professor of Information Systems, and a leading expert on platform strategy and business models. And also Chrysanthos Dellarocas, Associate Provost for Digital Learning and Innovation here at BU, and the Shipley Professor of Management at the Equestrian School of Business. Professor Dellarocas leads the advancement of activities that enhance education at Boston University through the strategic use of digital technologies. Certainly we have the right panel for today's topic. Today we're talking about Professor Hagiu and Dellarocas' recent article in Harvard Business Review on strategies to navigate the emerging landscape of learning platforms in higher education. Welcome, Andrei and Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
So why don't we start with a question? It seems that almost every other company in ed tech today is using the term platform to refer to its products. What are the learning platforms that you focused on in your article?
Yeah, that's a great question, Pete. And it's great to start with that because, yeah, platform is indeed a very popular term in today's educational technology landscape. So there are at least three different kinds of systems that we've heard been referred to as learning platforms. The one that we focus on in an article are learning marketplaces. These are systems that host educational programs from a variety of providers. Systems like Coursera, edX, Udemy, Udacity, Pluralsight, Skillsoft, Skillshare, LinkedIn Learning, etc. People also refer to learning platforms for systems that essentially allow a single organization put courses online and manage them. Think of them as like online course storefronts for single organizations. Companies in that category include LearnWords, Teachable, Thinkific, Podia. And we've also heard the traditional LMSs, learning management systems like Blackboard, Canvas, and Moodle sometimes to be referred to as platforms. What we talk about in the article are the learning marketplaces because we believe that these are the systems that will most profoundly transform the education landscape.
I mean, the one thing I would add, just to clarify a little bit, to put it in perspective, it's a bit in education, like in other industries, there's this confusion between marketplaces and B2B platforms. So it's basically the same confusion as people make between, say, something like Amazon, which is a proper marketplace, and something like Shopify, which provides tools to sellers to sell on their own. So again, just to emphasize, what we're focusing on is proper marketplaces, which connect learners and providers.
So how important are these learning platforms today?
Learning platforms, and by that we mean learning marketplaces, they have made quite a big inroad in the areas of adult education, especially upskilling, reskilling. A lot of corporations are contracting directly with those platforms to offer upskilling and reskilling content for their employees. Platforms are also growing in executive education. Now, in the area of degrees, especially graduate degrees, which is of course of most interest to traditional higher education institutions like BU, platforms are growing, but I don't think they have completely made their mark yet. The most visible platforms in the space are edX and Coursera. They've had a lot of traction in the last few years, but I wouldn't say that by any means they are dominant in the same way that platforms are in other industries. I don't know, Andrei, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I think it's the mind share that these learning platforms, the learning marketplaces gets is increasing, but I don't think we're at the level yet of, say, a booking.com for learning or a Airbnb or something like. It's not quite at that scale, but we might be getting there.
So you mentioned Airbnb, Booking.com, or even like Uber. Like, why haven't platforms like that or marketplaces like that emerged? You know, being something that would kind of market, I guess, all the other offerings of all in one place, so to speak?
That's a great question. I've asked myself that for a long time, and here are some answers that Andrei and I could come up with. I guess for one thing, until recently, when people were looking for, let's say, an undergraduate or graduate program, they were looking locally. So the search space was not very large. There was not a need to compare too many different programs. Also, until recently, programs were rather standard. So if you wanted to study business, well, you got an MBA. If you wanted to be an engineer, there was a handful of specializations you could choose from. There wasn't enough variety that would basically warrant the need for a platform. And then the other important reason, which actually is still a concern to some extent, is that one of the most important roles of platforms is also to provide some information about quality and fit, help people find products and services which are of good quality and a good match for them. So unlike, let's say, when you're choosing cameras or even where you're selecting hotels, it is much more difficult to provide reliable information about education's quality. Because education is a service and a product that even after you experience it, suppose you go through an undergraduate program, right? I mean, many of us did not fully appreciate the quality or even the shortcomings of the program we attended until many, many years afterwards. So for that reason, a lot of the traditional signals of quality that platforms are using, like online reviews or endorsements, are not as reliable in education. So that's one of the reasons why some portals that have sprang up across over the years that basically give you access and comparison of program never really gained traction in the same way, let's say, Booking.com or TripAdvisor has in hospitality.
Right, and actually, so it made me think, part of the reason, right, I mean, I think this is sort of the essence of it, it's essentially the quality, the measure of quality in the eyes of the customers, which would be the learners, up until recently and still now, by and large, is essentially the certification, right? It's like you had a degree from here. It's less about, well, how good is this individual course? Now, part of that is because, well, you go to the labor marketplace, like what does it matter? What matters the most? Well, up until now, it's like, you got a degree, what is your degree in? I think which is unlike other products where people are just like, okay, I just care about the quality of this individual product. How good is this individual product? And then, yes, like Chris is saying, there's ratings and reviews, there's ways to figure out that quality online, and platforms are particularly good at this. With education, again, it's not, at least until recently, it wasn't so much about the individual quality of a specific course. It's more about, I just need to get a certification, right? It's like whether or not I had the best Python or like the best whatever, like data science course, like of all those availables, mattered less than maybe like I got a degree from this university and then I can take that degree and go to my employers and show the degree.
So certainly valid reasons why it doesn't exist today, or it hasn't come up yet, because of all the things that you've mentioned, but do you think it's coming? I mean, it being this type of Uber, Airbnb collection or platform?
Oh yeah, and that's why we wrote the article.
Yeah.
We are both convinced it's coming, and there are some very good reasons for that. I mean, for one, more and more institutions are now launching programs aimed at the whole nation or the world. Geography is less important, so the number of possible choices that a learner has increased substantially. And so has the difficulty of marketing those programs to learners. I mean, many of us are finding that every year with increased competition, the traditional ways of marketing and programs are becoming fragmented and inefficient. So it is much more convenient if there is a single place or a handful of places where learners go and institutions go and they get matched with each other. I mean, the other reason is that it is the rise of adult education, which is much more personalized. So if you're an undergrad, yeah, there's a handful of different degrees you can get. But if you are a 35-year-old adult who realizes that they need to refresh their skills, your needs are very, very specific to you individually, and you need a lot of very customized and personalized guidance that platforms are very well equipped to provide.
And which are not offered by traditional, like which traditional educational institutions have been very slow to offer, right?
Yeah, and I guess if you just look into the venture capital space, I know Andrei has some more specific things to say about that. I mean, there's a lot of investment right now in this direction, which basically shows that the community is voting with their money, that this is a direction that will grow.
Yeah, I mean, I think the view from it's exactly to reinforce this. I mean, the view from the outside. I mean, I've heard this many times, like speaking with VCs and investors. I mean, they look at education as one of these like very traditional, very old industries that is just massively, it's riddled with inefficiencies and it's ripe for disruption. So there's a lot of platforms coming, again, of VC-funded startups that are creating platforms for learning, essentially addressing the inefficiencies that Chris was talking about. A lot of it, I think, initially is focused indeed at adult education. So people who, already have degrees, but they have very specific needs. And in particular, what these platforms are targeting is like, there's some very glaring inefficiencies in the traditional education market. Number one is extremely high price, like very high and increasing prices. So you think about the cost of undergraduate degrees, but increasing over time, and it's unclear that price adjusted quality of whatever of that particular product, the education product, can justify that increase in prices. The second one is the inefficiency of matching. Again, you may be, you go to university, you get a degree, like you have a major, it's unclear that you're truly able to choose the things that are, you really need. And in particular, are you truly getting the courses and the skills that are most sought after and most useful in the labor marketplace, right? So there's this perceived disconnect between what traditional education institutions are offering and what employers are really want. And that's what the VC funded platforms are going after. They're saying, look, we'll actually start, we'll start with the customer, with the end customer, which is the employees. Like, what are the skills that are needed? And we're going to offer what Chris was saying, like very specialized courses to teach you those specific skills. And you can choose those courses, just focus on that. And, it's almost like, yeah, then I know I can get a job in those particular areas. So I think that's what leads us to believe. I mean, it's very clear that there's going to be large marketplaces that essentially connect these two sides, like the employers and the learners. So sorry, the employers are in the downstream, but the providers, the course providers, and the learners, and they're going to do this they're going to connect it to in a much more efficient way than has traditionally been done by education institutions.
By the way, to our audience, please enter any questions in the Q&A box. We'd love to have Q&A after our initial discussions. But Andrei and Chris, to build off that, so sounds pretty disruptive, right? Is this good news or bad news for universities? And what do we in universities do?
Well, I mean, at a high level, just like in any other industries, I mean, there's an upside from platforms, and then there's a downside that is a bit more insidious and becomes clear a little bit later on, right? But initially, platforms do create a lot of value, right? So initially, it's very clear that, let's say, if you're a course provider, I mean, even a university, like, participating on one of these learning platforms is just a way to reach a lot more learners a lot more efficiently, right? So you can reach, you can offer a course, instead of being constrained to offering a course to people who are physically in your geography or come to your school. You can take your course now and offer it to a lot more people all over the world without geographical boundaries, right? So there's definitely lots of upside. Now, the downside, we'll get more into detail into that, but at a high level, there's always a significant downside to consider with platforms, and that is, once you start participating on platforms, eventually platforms tend to commoditize you, right? So you start being dependent on platforms, they start taking control of your customers, you have to compete with more providers on the platform, and it's no longer clear that you have as much control over your customers or learners that you previously had.
Yeah, I mean, to put it in a, to say the same thing somewhat differently, right? From my perspective as a practitioner of helping the university launch programs. Well, currently, when we want to market a program, we have a variety of channels that we try to advertise, you know, Facebook, Google, newspapers, billboards, what have you, right? It would be much, and those channels are becoming saturated as more and more programs are using them, right? So it would be much simpler, instead of having to worry about a gazillion of channels, to just, you know, place my program into a couple of platforms and get most of the demand that way. So that's simple, right? But by doing so, as I sometimes say, I am being reduced to one line in a long list of search results, right? So my brand gets diluted. The other thing that's interesting is that that was something that was true, actually, especially for places like Coursera and edX that tend to host programs from well-known universities. So when learners take a course from, let's say, Coursera, from Stanford, for example, they often don't say this is a Stanford course, they say it's a Coursera course, right? So so in some ways, already even some pretty strong brands are losing, and they are being diluted by being part of this platform. And this is really the I think the biggest danger. I mean, platforms, don't get me wrong, platforms are actually, they have the potential of being very good for the learners, right? And that's why platforms are bound to become successful, because they will simplify the learner's problem, and they will likely lead to better matching between learners and programs, which is all good. In terms of whether they're good or bad for the university, depends on the balance of power, right? That universities and platforms maintain. And I think a large part of our article is boiling down to giving advice to universities for helping maintain a balance of power that will be beneficial for everybody, as opposed to extreme solutions where, let's say, a platform becomes too dominant for anybody's good. And I think we'll talk more about that later on in the conversation.
Well, shall we jump in now? I mean, what can they do? What can universities do to take advantage of the emergence of these platforms? What are your advice points?
Sure. So we can drill a little bit into some of these, right? So again, I mean, there's high level, there's two things. I mean, obviously you want to get the most, like make the most out of participating on platforms. So, you know, what are the things that universities can do? Like what are the biggest sources of value from platforms? Well, again, it's access to more learners. Now, again, that by itself is not enough. What you want to do as a university is you want to the extent possible, you want to be a first mover, at least in a specific area, say a specific type of course or specific discipline, and try to offer something unique, right? I mean, again, like learning on platforms, especially on online platforms, is a little bit different from learning in person, the traditional learning. So as a university, you just want to take full advantage of the new tools, of the new formats that is enabled by learning platforms. So I think one thing, Chris can talk more about this, but I've observed it as well. A lot of universities tend to be very conservative in their approaches. And when they're thinking, well, what should we do about this new technology, about new platforms? They always look at other, what they call like peer institutions, and say, well, let's just, like, our peer institutions are doing this, let's also do this, which is really funny, especially if we're talking about business schools, because we always teach differentiation, right? It's like try something slightly different. So I'll let Chris articulate a bit more about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, so learning platforms have actually worked pretty well for institutions as innovation engines, right? Or leaders of innovation networks. I mean, institutions tend to be conservative and really not trying to venture away from mainstream. So our experience, let me just give you our experience with edX. BU is a partner of edX since 2013, I believe, yeah. So edX has really helped us get out of our comfort zone and try new things that have actually worked out very well for us. Like, for example, we started with MOOCs. I mean, MOOCs themselves didn't have a big impact in the way we teach and learn at BU, but at least they brought the notion of educational innovation on campus, right? As they did with many other R1 universities. Then edX came up with the idea of micromasters, right? This is an innovation. You put a part of a master's degree online at a low price at MOOCs, and then learners who complete the micromasters can apply and then enroll at the regular masters, and they get some credit for the courses they complete as MOOCs. So that was a new idea, right? And because we were an edX partner, we had a policy at BU of experimenting with every new idea of edX. So we had some faculty members at our school, at the Questrom School, who out of their own initiative built a micromasters in digital leadership, which is still around, right? So this basically brought the idea of digital learning at the Questrom School of Management that at the time had no plans to do anything in the online sphere, right? So the platform really kind of pushed the faculty to innovate. And next thing you know, 2 years later, edX came to us and then proposed to Questrom to be their online MBA partner. So they basically proposed to BU to launch a disruptively priced $24,000 online MBA. And the fact that we've done the micromasters made it much easier for the school to accept and move forward with the idea. There were already some faculty who had experience with producing online courses with edX. They have seen that even though it was a very time-consuming process, the dividends were very high. They saw the impact those courses had and the number of people they would touch. There were other faculty who had this experience, and they stepped forward and led the effort. And as a result, BU basically innovated in terms of launching this pretty disruptive program, right? Especially for where we were as a school. And today, BU is because of those successes, has created a new unit, BU Virtual, which is working to create a more large-scale online degrees. So that's just an example of how our participation in that platform has helped us, served as an engine of innovation for the institution. And so that's actually a non-trivial benefit of being part of the platform.
Mm. And by the way, it does. So I think just to emphasize this again, I think the key point there, it doesn't happen by itself. It's not a matter of like, oh, sign up to the platform and just like take your existing course and put it on the platform, right? I mean, it's not. I mean, it does require some investment in trying to figure out, how do I offer something that's a little bit different and that's tailored specifically to the environment, the learning environment that is enabled by platforms. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's some opportunities, for example, I mean, there's definitely always like very low hanging fruit that universities can go after. So let's say you have like some courses that when you're teaching them online, it's kind of like long tail, low demand courses. And now because of platforms, you can put those courses on the platforms and instantly reach a lot of people. I mean, I think that's nice, right? So it's, again, low hanging fruit. But I think the real opportunities is basically what Chris described, like something where you truly make an effort, you put some thought and investment into designing courses or even degrees that take advantage of the opportunities created by platforms.
Yeah, but of course, Andrei, I don't want to underplay also the long tail opportunity that you just mentioned. This, for example, less commonly taught languages, right? Think about courses which cannot really have sufficient demand in a single institution. But then if you offer them to the world through a platform, you can actually make it a very viable proposition. And this is particularly important for institutions that perhaps do not have the strongest brand, right? I think platforms,
right, and they might be offering something that no one else is offering, right? So they don't have a brand, but they just have some course, like some weird language course that nobody else offers.
Well, there's many topics, not necessarily weird, right? But which are niche. Let's call them niche topics, right? I mean,
Fair enough. There's no judgment involved. Okay, yeah.
yeah, and a lot of those institutions actually are right now in distress, right? Because the traditional sources of enrollment are drying up, and they might not have the brand to compete in the traditional space. But
Yeah.
platforms and the long tail phenomenon gives them a very interesting avenue that they could potentially pursue.
Right. Right. So that's the okay. So that's the part where, I mean, again, that's the part where the institutions are just trying to take, we're saying take full advantage of this new channel, like this new medium, which is online learning platforms. The second part, and I think this is the more strategic part that we emphasize quite a bit in the article we want to talk about, is there's also an element, if you're learning institutions, part of the reason to participate on platforms is you also want to make sure that the platforms don't end up fully dominating you. You don't end up completely subservient to the platforms.
Exactly. I mean, in my view, in our view, actually, I think Andrei and I are fully aligned on this. I mean, platforms can be actually good for the learner and good for the institution, as long as A, there is a good balance of power between institution and platform, and B, there is healthy competition among platforms in the marketplace. Competition that keeps every platform in check. The dangers, the biggest dangers that platforms pose to incumbent industries, not just in education, but I think everywhere, is A, that if we have an outcome where we have a single or dominant platform, then that dominant platform or the two dominant platforms, they have too much market power. They have too much market power, which ends up in, they can basically do things that are not good for either side of the market, not good for the learner, not good for the institution. They can charge exorbitant fees. They can control who is visible and who's not visible based on criteria other than quality. See what's happening with Twitter these days. And so we want to avoid that. And then the other danger is actually that if platforms really are successful in their social mission of becoming a really good partner for the learner, providing them access to choice, wide choice, and really good objective guidance, they may end up owning the relationship with the learner and snatching it away from institutions who then become content providers. I mean, these are really the two biggest dangers that platforms pose to institutions. And I think the answer to that is, what's interesting, I mean, in the case of education, we have a situation where platforms are not dominant yet. So institutions at this point have a chance to play the game in ways that will try to maximize the probability that, we'll maintain a healthy competition and a healthy balance of power. This is actually one of the main reasons why Andrei and I decided to write this article now. Right? People might think, oh, platforms are not as important yet, but this is now, your actions now are going to affect what happens in 5 years. Right? And so what are some of the things that institutions can do? Like, the first one thing that we mentioned is don't be tied to a single platform. Place your eggs in multiple baskets. In some ways, water and support multiple platforms, because what do we want as institutions is we want to have a healthy competition among platforms, right? So to the extent that's possible, place your courses in multiple platforms and don't get too tied up with any single platform. I mean, platforms try to entice you. They say, well, we also have not just access to students, but we have a delivery platform if you want, and we can offer you some student recruitment services, et cetera, et cetera. Those are, in the short run, these are convenient functions to outsource to the platform, but in the long run, you become too dependent on the platform, right? And so what you want is to have multiple relationships, and to the extent that's possible, to have your own internal capability, so you have the agility to move from one platform to another if the terms of engagement become, less than favorable for you.
And by the way, I mean, just to emphasize, like, I'm sure this must sound to everyone, it's like, oh yeah, of course, but actually in reality, like, it's true for universities, it's true in other industries as well. Like, I think we want to emphasize, it's not so trivial in practice, because, we're basically saying, for example, multi-home, so work with multiple platforms. I mean, once you start thinking about it, it's like, yeah, it's a little bit cumbersome, right? I mean, it's much easier to just work with one platform and say, okay, I'll just focus on that relationship and, just try to optimize for that. But again, the point is like, yeah, it's very convenient in the short run, and platforms are very good at sucking you into that. The issue, of course, then you become, as you work more and more, and as you make more relationship-specific investments to say one platform, then you become more dependent on it, and then later on they can turn around and, let's say, either increase the fees, or more subtly, they can basically change the terms, or bring more competition. And then you find yourself you have less and less choice, or fewer and fewer options, if you will.
Yeah, the second issue, which is losing or not losing the relationship with the learner. I mean, so keep in mind that the learners of today are likely to be lifelong learners. So these are learners who will, need to educate and re-educate and re-educate themselves multiple times. So when you have a learner taking your program, yes, you have a relationship with them. But the question is, how do you maintain this relationship after they have completed your program, right? As opposed to them going back to the platform. So there, it's a tricky value proposition, because in principle, platforms have the upper hand. I mean, they can offer choice among multiple programs, and then they can also give you some, career and selection guidance. So what can institutions do? So here's the ideas that we have here. So in some ways, institutions have an advantage in that they have built a deep relationship with students, particularly students who took their traditional programs. I mean, especially undergraduate students, right? Institutions have way more information about those students than anybody else. And they have an emotional connection. And also the other thing institutions have is the network among those students who then become alumni, right? And networks are another very important source of advice and guidance for, continued upskilling, reskilling, and career prospects. So institutions have the opportunity to build on those relationships and develop alumni portals that they can be used as forums for guiding alumni to, upskilling, reskilling, career pathways, education pathways. And of course, most institutions I have spoken with, they immediately think of those portals as ways for them to sell their, graduate programs and non-degree certificates. But I would really push them. So we would push them to go one step further. Because, I mean, the reasons why people go to platform is because they want choice. And no single institution, no matter how good it is, has courses and programs that basically cover everyone's needs. So what if institutions created portals, alumni portals, where they offer access to networks, career advice, upskilling advice, reskilling advice, and access to educational programs, not only from themselves, but from other institutions potentially that have complementary offerings, right? So in that way, institutions become almost mini platforms, right? And then mini platforms, they compete on the depth of relationship, they compete on the depth of the network they can offer. And not because they want to substitute platforms, but simply in terms of maintaining this balance of powers and making it even more difficult that a single platform will emerge as the undisputed dominant market owner. I mean, this is really the outcome we really want to prevent from happening.
Right.
Great. Wow. A lot there. Switching gears, how about online program managers, OPMs? How are they different than learning platforms? Or could you define them can we start by defining them for the audience?
Well, thanks for asking this question, because every single person in the industry who has read our articles, they come back to us and say, okay, so what does this article mean about OPMs, online program managers? I mean, it's interesting. So online program managers are businesses, for-profit businesses to which educational institutions outsource certain functions of producing, marketing, and managing online programs. So, so suppose that an institution wants to launch an online program, but they have no expertise in doing that. So OPMs, they step in and they produce the videos and they help restructure the teaching so that it's appropriate for online format. And in some cases, they offer the digital platform through which the videos live and can be deployed, and they do the marketing in exchange for a revenue share. So these are OPMs, right? So OPMs typically live in the background, right? So they're not visible to learners. I mean, the learner still deals with institution, and these are essentially, and some functions associated with the online program are carried out by the OPM. Okay, platforms, in contrast, I mean, their main role is to host programs from multiple providers. So for one thing, platforms very much cultivate a customer-facing brand because that's the main asset, right? The main asset of a platform is to have a very strong brand and have a website that lots of people go and visit, right? So that's an important difference. And also the problem they solve is different, right? So OPMs help institutions that do not have the capacity to get off the ground quickly and launch online programs, whereas, that's OPMs, right? Whereas platforms, they basically aspire to solve the matching problem. They aspire to make the matching between learners and programs more efficient. Now, one reason why people are confused is that some platforms currently also offer OPM services, but these are usually optional. Like an example, the edX platform that BU is working with also offers a deployment, and a platform where we can actually host videos and courses and interact with learners. And now that it has merged with another company called BU, it also offers course production services. However, Boston University does not use any of those services, right? Boston University produces its online MBA in-house, right? It hosts online MBA on its own platform, in its own LMS, learning management system, and is using edX simply as a way to, generate leads and make its program visible to a larger audience. So those are two different kinds of business models that people often confuse, but they are distinct.
Yeah, I would say just again to bring back to like another analogy, think of OPMs as Shopify. It's like Shopify for universities. They offer backend white label services, and then the platforms are basically the eBays and the Amazons. These are the proper marketplaces.
So I guess the Biden administration has announced an initiative for oversight of OPMs. What's behind that? What are people worried about?
Yeah, so OPMs have gathered some negative publicity over the years because in a small number of cases, OPMs, they share revenue, right? So the more students they manage to enroll in a program, the more money they make. So in a few cases, they have aggressively marketed programs to students for whom these programs were not a good fit. And so students ended up with a lot of debt and degrees that did not really fulfill their expectations. So that's behind most of the criticism. Now platforms, they have, if you think of the platform business model, right, their main incentive is not to push specific programs. What platforms care about is that aggregate long-term audience and revenues, right? And so especially if there is competition among platforms, audience will grow if platforms develop a reputation for quality programs and objective guidance, right? So as long as there is competition in the platform space, I think that platforms will largely do the right thing for the learners. Now, having said that, if we end up with one or two dominant platforms, then as we already discussed, there are several dangers there. So, some oversight is certainly needed in the platform space as well, but there has to be a clear understanding of how platforms and OPMs are different and how the benefits and pitfalls of each of those business models are distinct.
But in the extreme, what I hear you saying is perhaps would it end up with a regulated monopoly, perhaps of few platforms.
Well, if platforms do not necessarily end up in a monopoly. I mean, there are monopolies in some areas. For example, think of the mobile app space is dominated by the Google Play and the App Store, right? I mean, both platforms are monopolies in their respective areas. And I mean, there's lots of problems with that. I mean, this is not the space to discuss them, but you can just do a Google search and see all the problems that exist when a platform industry becomes a monopoly.
So, heard some great news about how on our BU example we've had inspiration, innovation from platforms. There's opportunity to encourage long tail, all good things. There's certainly some risks. Very well articulated, but before we get into some Q&A, what's the bottom line for university leaders? What's next?
Be as proactive as possible. So I think, just go back to what we talked about earlier. I think even though the strict online learning marketplaces today may not appear to be too threatening or too dominant, there's a very real chance that they will grow over time, and they might be. So I think for university leaders, it's important to be proactive along the lines that we discussed. Try to take advantage of those platforms, like take advantage of the opportunities they offer, but also think strategically, like in terms of, say, diversifying your bets, supporting multiple platforms, reduce dependency on any one platform in order to keep the quote unquote keep the platforms honest, right? I mean, you want to keep like some competition between platforms, so that we don't end up with a situation in which either Android versus iOS for mobile apps, or something like Booking.com and Expedia for travel.
Yeah, and I would like to add, educate yourself on platform economics and platform strategies. So this is a space which is relatively it's non-trivial. There are some very interesting, counterintuitive economic effects and ways in which platforms compete, and partners should interact with platforms that at this point they're not. I mean, most educational leaders are not very much aware of. So just to put a little plug here, the Western School of Business is one of the world's hubs of research and know-how on platform economics. I mean, my co-author Andrei is one of the leading economists in this space. So we're even considering offering programs geared towards higher education in this space. So if you have an interest in this area and you want to know more, you feel free to contact me or Andrei with your comments. We will very much like to have a conversation and see how we can help the industry in this area.
Absolutely. We're very interested in that, partnering with industry. So we have a few questions. We'll read them and let you to respond. First one, from an anonymous attendee: will the evolution of this marketplace result in a decrease in students completing full degree programs, such as master's degrees, and instead create an increase in micro-credentials, or even simply taking just specific courses? So will it cut in or cannibalize from traditional degree programs?
Yeah, interesting. That's an excellent question, and of course we have no crystal ball, but I think it's not the evolution of the marketplace, but the evolution of the world of work that is going to favor just that.
Agreed.
So what is happening is that the half-life of skills and competencies goes down, right? Who was saying, I forget the management scholar who said the half-life of skills is 5 years, right? So if I need to go back to refresh my skills every 5 years or every 3 years, right? Chances are I will not want to go back and do a 1 year or 1.5 year master's degree, right? I will need to have a much more frequent and much more personal and surgical refreshment of my skills. So all of this favors non-degree micro-credentials as opposed to large master's degrees. So we haven't seen this phenomenon yet, but I foresee that in the next 5 to 10 years, it will become much more pronounced.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. I think the answer is, to me, the answer is Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's just everything points in that direction, right? I mean, it's just much more efficient to match skill to individual courses than these broad degrees. And again, as the matching gets more efficient, people realize I need like A, B skills to do this particular job. Like there's no, and of course I need to keep upgrading those skills, like Chris was saying. The value of a broad, these like broader masters or like the degrees like tends to decrease. Like the value of, let's call it credentialism, will probably go away.
Interesting. Great. Second question from Dave Epstein. Hi, Dave. Do platforms disenfranchise universities by allowing individual professors to brand themselves separate from universities? In that world, where do universities fit?
That's a really good question too. I can take a stab at this. I mean, I thought a little bit about it recently. So, I mean, I don't think it necessarily disenfranchises universities, just to be clear. I mean, there's definitely a lot of things that universities offer which are not, I don't know how to call it, not subject to disruption by the learning platforms. Let's say research. I mean, there's a ton of stuff related to research and things like that you're better off doing. Like obviously universities play a big role. Now, I do think it makes it easier for individual professors to brand themselves. And I think the initial reaction of most universities to try to fight that, to say, no, we own you. Like we own your research, we own you, like we'll prevent you from doing that. And I think honestly, that's very silly because there's definitely a way to play this in like that in a way that actually benefits the university. I mean, obviously, like you can raising the profile of individual professors can help the university. You can think about, so coming back to some of the recommendations that we made, if you truly have offerings that are complementary to online platforms, and or even better, you create these mini platforms for alumni and things like that. Well, if your professors have a better brand name outside the university, that can only help to increase the draw to the offerings that the university puts out. So, I mean, I really don't think this has to be zero sum, unlike how some universities might perceive it today.
Yeah, by the way, there is already one platform that's doing that, and it's interesting to see how this experiment goes. It's called Udemy. So Udemy is interesting because it's the Airbnb of education. It allows anybody in the world to put together a course and post it. They have about 250,000 courses on all possible subjects. And, at this point, I don't think anybody would consider going to Udemy as opposed to getting a degree from a university, but it's very, very interesting to see how this experiment evolves and what happens with it.
Yeah, so for example, professors who are some professors who are very, very good at teaching, they can go there and they can sort of expand, they can expand their brand, if you will, outside the university. They can create very popular courses.
Yeah, the other thing is that we operate under this worldview that a course is a professor, right? It's very much, the course is basically the work of a single professor, and that's really increasingly not the case, right? I mean, I think education is a teamwork, right? And increasingly so if you want to do like an online production, right? And so you need multiple instructors or multiple roles. So it's really no longer like, as a single person basically who owns the course end to end. So especially if you want to have, courses that constantly innovate and renew themselves, I mean, you need probably resources that are beyond what a single person can offer. So you need teams of people, and that doesn't, conceivably, you can still have those teams be independent, like of a university. But what I'm saying is that there are certain economies of scale of having a lot of people together that will probably, keep universities around for quite some time.
Certainly. And I know you both have global reputations and stellar global reputations, and I'm sure it only helps be you because of your affiliation.
Yeah, it's a circle, right? It goes both ways.
Exactly.
So how do new technologies such, of course, we couldn't get through a webinar without a question on ChatGPT. So how will it reshape online education platforms?
In fact, in fact, neither Chris nor I were here on this webinar. It was just our pictures and it was ChatGPT answering.
Thank you. Right. Yes.
Oh, wow. Well, okay. So you caught us on this one. I mean, there is ChatGPT. To be honest with you, it's so early for us to say something authoritative about it. But here are some ideas, right? So, okay. So to the extent that ChatGPT is already becoming a substitute for a search engine, right? I mean, platforms. I mean, as we discussed, one of the biggest potential added values of platforms is objective and sound guidance, right? So you guide someone in terms of selecting the best educational pathways for him or her. So you can potentially use generative AI to do this, right? I mean, how do you help them search for possibilities, right? You have generative AI that can assess the resume, can assess where they are in life, and can offer ultra intelligent advice based on everything that they know on what they should do. That's one possible way in which ChatGPT can be integrated into online education platforms. I don't know if Andrei has some more ideas, but we can go back and forth.
No, I think that's fair. So I haven't thought too much about it. I mean, one thing that strikes me, I'm not sure. So I haven't thought too deeply about this, but I mean, I think in general, ChatGPT raises interesting questions for education in general. Like, I'm not sure maybe there's some specific things about online education platforms, but I think in general, yeah, we need to figure out, whether you teach on an online platform, whether you teach at the university. I mean, yeah, there's certainly some challenges with, say, what is the content? What does that do, say, to I don't know, to tests, to exams, to what are the things that we should be focusing on teaching versus things that can be easily answered by ChatGPT and do not require the expertise of a professor.
I mean, ChatGPT is a tool that changes the way that humans are performing intellectually demanding tasks.
Yeah.
Right. So it goes way beyond education and plagiarism and assessments. It will basically change what skills educated humans will need to have to be successful in the world of tomorrow.
Agreed.
Right. I mean, I used ChatGPT this past weekend to help me rewrite some code so that it runs faster, right? And ChatGPT gave me some very interesting directions, but also made a couple of errors that someone who doesn't understand coding very deeply wouldn't have caught. So ChatGPT became almost like a collaborator, right? So this fundamentally changes. I think we need to, most people think plagiarism and how can we change assessments, which of course in the short run, it's something we need to figure out. But in the longer term, it really will change what we need to be capable of doing so that we can be most effective. Some of the things that are important today will no longer be important, the same way that calculations by hand became less important once we have electronic calculators. And then other things like, how do you collaborate with a machine in a way that's effective? It will become much more important than they were before.
Right. So, presumably there will be courses on online education platforms on how to leverage ChatGPT on whatever, in say coding or any kind of creative process.
Yeah, but ChatGPT could be, I think the same way that, now Bing, with all the caveats, right? Instead of having a search engine, you talk to ChatGPT, right? I think the interfaces to platforms might change in that direction at the minimum.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today for your wonderful insights and your contributions. This has been a fantastic discussion. Any final words?
Well, yeah, as I said, if any of our listeners are interested in these topics, we really believe, one reason we wrote these articles, because we really believe that higher education leaders, they need to look into the platform space a little deeper, right? This is a set of ideas which are not yet very prevalent. So if anybody is interested in talking with us, they can contact either Andrei or myself. We'd love to have more of a conversation with you.
Yeah.
Andrei, final word?
And we will most likely create an online course on how to deal with online learning platforms.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. Thank you all in the audience for your participation and interest. And with that, we will bring this discussion to an end. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, Pete.